The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad omen as far as Augusta Abbott was concerned, because every terrible thing that had ever happened to her had happened on a Tuesday, her father's death, the drought of 1881, and now this. A scrawled notice from the county land office informing her that Matthew Garrison's cattle had been grazing the southern edge of her property for going on 3 weeks, and if she wished to pursue the matter formally, she had precisely 30 days to file the appropriate paperwork. Augusta read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen window of the Abbott farmhouse with the morning sun cutting hard across the floorboards and a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. She was 26 years old, had been running this ranch alone for 2 years since her mother passed and her brother Eli rode east to chase some fool notion about a law degree, and she had exactly 0 patience left for men who thought the rules of land and boundary applied to everyone except themselves. It was the autumn of 1883, and the high plains of eastern Colorado were just beginning to feel the first cold fingers of the season sliding down from the mountains. The grass had been sparse this year, everyone knew it, and she understood in the part of her mind that was still reasonable and fair thinking that a man whose herd needed pasture would push his cattle wherever the eating was good. She understood it. That did not mean she had to accept it. She set down the coffee, pulled on her coat, and went to find her foreman. Hank Dooley was a man of 62 who walked with a limp from a fall he had taken off a buckboard some years back, and he had worked the Abbott land since before Augusta was born. He was in the barn when she found him, repairing a section of bridle with the slow, careful patience that characterized everything he did. "Garrison's cattle are on our south pasture again," she said without preamble. Hank did not look up from the leather. "I know it. You know it. Saw them yesterday morning. Figured you'd seen the letter by now." Augusta pressed her lips together. "Why did you not say something sooner?" He finally looked up at her, and his old eyes were cautious in the way they always were when he was navigating something delicate. "Because the last time someone rode up to the north pasture to have words with Matthew Garrison, they came back saying they couldn't find him. Man doesn't come down." "What do you mean, he doesn't come down?" "Means exactly what it sounds like, Miss Abbott. Garrison hasn't come off that north stretch of his inn going on 3 seasons now. People in town say he just stays up there with his cattle and his dogs and nobody sees him except occasionally from a distance." Augusta stared at him. "3 seasons," she said flatly, "near as anyone can figure." She turned and looked out through the open barn door at the pale autumn sky, and she thought about that for a long moment. 3 seasons was a year and a half, roughly. A year and a half of a man sitting up on a hill pasture while the rest of the world turned around him. She could not decide if that was tragic or simply peculiar. "Well," she said at last, "his cattle aren't in the north pasture. They're in my south field, and that means I'm going to file the dispute with the county land office, and when they send someone out to settle it, maybe that'll be reason enough for him to come down." Hank nodded slowly. "You want me to ride to town?" "I'll go myself," Augusta said. "Tomorrow morning." She went to Caldwell the next morning, which was the nearest town of any real size, a rough collection of buildings along a main street that always smelled faintly of horse and river mud. The land office was a narrow building between the assay office and the post house, run by a man named Gerald Finch who wore spectacles and had the harried look of someone perpetually overwhelmed by paperwork. Augusta filed her complaint clearly and precisely, describing the boundary in question, the approximate number of cattle she had observed on her property, and the duration of the encroachment. Finch wrote it all down, stamped 3 different documents, and told her that a formal notice would be sent to the Garrison property within the week. "You know he doesn't come to town," Finch said, with the air of a man imparting information he expected would annoy her. "Then the notice will have to go to him," Augusta said pleasantly. "That's rather the point of sending it, I'd imagine." She rode home feeling righteous and just slightly guilty about the righteousness, because she had seen from a distance last spring what the Garrison herd looked like, and the cattle were thin. Whatever was happening up in that north pasture, it was not going entirely well. But that, she reminded herself, was not her problem to solve. The formal notice was sent. 10 days passed. No response came from the Garrison property. Augusta went about her work, which was considerable, because running a ranch of 400 acres with a 62-year-old foreman, 2 seasonal hands named Pete and Cord, and her own 2 hands required every hour of daylight and then some. She was mending fence on the south boundary herself one bright October morning, kneeling in the dry grass with wire cutters and a spool of fencing wire, when she heard hoofbeats. She stood up, shading her eyes against the morning glare. The rider was coming from the north, which meant he was coming from the direction of the Garrison property. He rode a big dark horse, a good animal with a clean stride, and as he came closer she could see that he was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had seen better days and a hat pulled down against the wind. He rode the way men who had spent their whole lives on horseback rode without thinking about it, the horse and the man moving together like a single deliberate thing. He slowed when he saw her, and then he stopped, and she stood there in the middle of the fence line with wire cutters in her hand and looked at him. Matthew Garrison was 31 years old, though Augusta did not know that yet. He had dark hair that wanted a cut and jaw that wanted a shave, and his eyes were a color she could not immediately name because the morning light was playing tricks, some shade between brown and gold that did not quite commit to either. He was looking at her with an expression she could not easily read. It was not hostile. It was not entirely comfortable either. It was the expression of a man who had been alone for a long time and had forgotten how to arrange his face for company. "Miss Abbott," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and steadier. "Mr. Garrison," she replied. He swung down from the horse in one fluid motion and stood holding the reins. He was taller than she had gauged from a distance. She was not a small woman, but he had a good 6 inches on her, and the broadness of his shoulders was more apparent now that he was standing still. "I got the notice," he said. "I expected you might. I'm sorry I didn't come down sooner." He said it simply, without elaborate explanation, and she noticed that. A man who apologized plainly without building scaffolding around it. "Your cattle are on my south pasture," she said. "Going on a month now." "I know it." He looked at the fence line, then at the pasture beyond, and his jaw tightened slightly in a way that told her he was genuinely troubled by it. "My south fence took damage in August. A section came down in a windstorm and I didn't get to it fast enough and the herd pushed through." He paused. "It was not intentional." "I did not assume it was," Augusta said, though if she were being honest with herself, she had half assumed exactly that and she appreciated being disabused of it. He looked at her then directly, and she felt the quality of his attention like something physical. He was not the sort of man who looked at a person partway. When he looked at you, he looked. "I'll move the cattle today," he said, "and I'll repair the fence. Yours was damaged when they came through, I can see it from here. I'd like to fix that too, if you'll allow it." Augusta blinked. That was not what she had expected him to say. She had expected negotiation or deflection or the blustering defensiveness she had learned to anticipate from men who were caught in the wrong. She had not expected a straightforward offer to fix what had been broken. "That would be acceptable," she said after a moment. He nodded once. He was turning back toward his horse when she heard herself speak again. "You want coffee?" He turned back and something crossed his face. Surprise, she thought, genuine surprise, as though the offer had not occurred to him as a possibility. "I have been riding since before dawn," he said carefully. "That means yes," Augusta said, and she picked up her wire cutters and started toward the house. She heard him follow, leading the horse. She tied the horse at the post out front and went inside, and when she pushed open the kitchen door, the warmth of the stove came out to meet her like a welcome. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table, and Matthew Garrison ducked through the door and stood for a moment as though he was calibrating himself to indoor space, which struck her as oddly endearing. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and said nothing for a moment, and she sat across from him and watched him absorb the warmth of it. 3 seasons, she said. He looked up. Hank tells me you haven't come off your north pasture in 3 seasons. His expression did not change exactly, but something in it went careful. Hank Dooley talks a lot. Hank Dooley has known this land since before I was born. He notices things. Matthew looked down at his coffee. 3 seasons, he confirmed quietly. Why? She did not know what possessed her to ask it so directly. It was not her business. She had just met this man, technically, though their properties bordered one another, and she had been aware of his existence for the 2 years she had been running this ranch. But there was something about the quality of the silence he carried, not unfriendly, not cold, but vast, like a man who had not spoken his thoughts aloud in so long that he was not sure they would still come out in the right order. He did not answer immediately. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. "My wife died," he said at last, 3 seasons ago. Augusta did not say she was sorry, because the word felt insufficient, and she had learned from her own grief that insufficient words landed wrong. She simply sat with it for a moment. "I didn't know," she said. "Clara." He said the name the way a man says a word he has not said aloud in a long time, carefully, like testing ice. "Fever, it came fast." "I'm sorry," she said then, because sitting without saying it any longer also felt wrong. He nodded. He looked up at her, and that golden-brown gaze was direct and undefended in a way that made her chest feel tight. "I took the cattle up to the north pasture because that is where I went after," he said. "I did not think I would stay so long, and then the seasons kept turning." She understood that. She understood it with her whole body, the way grief could make time do strange things, compressing it and stretching it at once, until a year and a half felt like both a week and a century. "I lost my mother 2 years ago," she said. "And then my father 3 years before that." He looked at her steadily. "You're running this place alone." Hank in 2 hands. Something in his expression shifted. It was not pity. She would have bristled at pity. It was something more like recognition. They drank their coffee in a silence that was, she realized, unexpectedly comfortable. The wind moved against the window glass. The stove ticked. Somewhere outside, one of the horses stamped. When he stood to go, she walked him to the door. "Mr. Garrison," she said. He turned. "Your fence, the south one that came down, do you have the materials to repair it?" He hesitated. "I can get them. I have spare fencing wire and posts in the barn. Take what you need." He looked at her for a long moment with that unsettlingly direct gaze, and she had the peculiar sensation of being seen with more clarity than she had been seen in some time. "That's generous," he said. "It's practical," she corrected. "A mended fence keeps your cattle on your side and mine on mine. That benefits both of us." The corner of his mouth moved just slightly. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one, and it changed his whole face when it appeared, softening something that had been held very tight. "I'll bring the materials back," he said. "You can return them when you come to fix my fence," Augusta said simply. He looked at her again. Then he put his hat on, untied his horse, and rode north. Augusta stood in the doorway for a moment after he disappeared, and then she went back inside and stood at the kitchen window looking out at nothing in particular, holding her empty coffee cup. She was not a woman who behaved foolishly. She was practical and clear-headed, and she had been managing her own life and her own property with a calm competence that she was genuinely proud of. She was not going to make anything of the way a man she had just met looked at her across a kitchen table. She washed the cups. She went back to mending fence. He came back 2 days later. She was in the yard splitting wood when she heard the horse, and she looked up to find him riding down from the north again with a second horse in tow, laden with tools and materials. He had also, she noticed as he drew closer, shaved. She noticed that and then told herself firmly that she had not noticed it. "Morning," he said, dismounting. "Morning," she said. He moved the cattle that day, working from horseback with a cattle dog she had not seen before, a black and white creature of tremendous energy and intelligence, who circled the herd with businesslike efficiency, while Matthew directed with quiet whistles and hand signals. Augusta watched from the fence line for a portion of the morning, and it struck her how different a man looked when he was in his element. He had seemed contained and careful in her kitchen. Out here with the horse and the dog and the work, there was an ease to him, an unself-consciousness that was compelling to watch. By noon, the cattle were back on Garrison land. He spent the afternoon repairing her south fence. She brought him water and then, at the end of the day, asked if he was staying for supper. He looked at the sky, then at his horse, then at her. "I shouldn't impose," he said. "I cooked enough stew for 4 people," she said. "Hank won't eat more than his portion, and the hands eat at the bunkhouse. Say yes, or the rest of it feeds the dogs." That not-quite smile appeared again. "Yes," he said. They ate at the kitchen table. She had lit the lamp because the evenings were drawing in now, and the light was warm and gold, and Hank ate with them, and was his usual taciturn self, occasionally making observations about fence repair or cattle movement that Matthew answered with the same economy. And Augusta watched the two of them develop a tentative mutual regard that expressed itself, as male mutual regard so often did, through the discussing of practical subjects. After supper, Hank excused himself with a meaningful look at Augusta that she chose to ignore. Matthew stayed to help wash the dishes, which was not something Augusta had expected, and which flustered her slightly in a way she managed, she hoped, not to show. They stood at the basin side by side, passing dishes between them, and the domesticity of it was almost shocking. "Clara used to say the dishes were the worst part," he said, unexpectedly. Augusta looked at him. "Of running a house," he added. She hated them. What was the best part? Augusta asked, because the question rose in her before she could evaluate whether it was appropriate. He thought about it. "Saturday mornings," he said at last. "When there was nothing pressing, she'd make biscuits and we'd sit at the table for an hour doing nothing useful." He handed her a clean plate to dry. "I haven't made biscuits since." "I make them every Saturday," Augusta said. "It was my mother's habit and I kept it." He looked at her sideways. "Does it help keeping the habits?" She considered the question honestly. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes it just reminds you." "Yes," he said quietly. "That." He left as the sky was going dark, and she watched him ride north until she lost him in the dusk. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and tried very hard not to think about anything in particular. He came back on Saturday. She discovered this when she was standing at the stove in the early morning light, just finishing the biscuits, and she heard a horse in the yard. She looked out the window, and there was the dark horse, and there was Matthew Garrison sitting on him looking uncertain, which was the most uncertain she had seen him look. She opened the door. "I was riding past," he said. She looked at him. Then she looked at the stretch of land around the house, which did not naturally occasion riding past unless your destination was the house itself. "Come in," she said. "Biscuits are ready." He did not say anything about the fact that it was Saturday, and neither did she. He dismounted and tied his horse and came inside, and they sat at the kitchen table with biscuits and butter and coffee, and outside the world was pale gold and very quiet, and they talked. Not about fences or cattle or property lines. They talked about other things. She told him about growing up on this land, about learning to ride before she could read, about her father's particular philosophy regarding the relationship between a person and the soil they worked. He told her about coming to Colorado from Kentucky at age 20, about why he had chosen cattle over crops, about the first winter he had spent on the North Pasture when the cold was so complete and so absolute that he had genuinely believed he would not see spring. She found that he was funny, in a quiet way, not performing humor, but occasionally saying something that was simply, dryly true, that made her laugh before she expected to. She found that he listened. Really listened, in the way that she had learned was rarer than it should be. When she spoke, he did not look at the middle distance waiting for his turn. He paid attention. She found that when he looked at her across the table, something in her chest did a thing she did not have precise words for, something warm and slightly terrifying. She found, in short, that she was in considerable trouble. He came back the following Tuesday, which somewhat revised her opinion of Tuesdays. He had a reason, a practical reason. He wanted to discuss the possibility of a shared water agreement regarding the creek that ran along the property line, which was a real and legitimate matter that needed addressing before winter set the ground too hard for any digging. They talked about it practically and sensibly and reached an agreement in 20 minutes, and then spent the following 2 hours talking about everything else. He stayed for lunch. He did not stay for supper, but as he was riding out he turned in the saddle and said, "Next Saturday," with a casualness that was slightly too studied to be entirely casual, and Augusta felt something unfold in her chest like a letter she had been keeping sealed. "Next Saturday," she agreed. October turned deeper, the air sharpening and the sky going that particular blue that only happened in the high plains autumn, a blue so saturated it looked almost unreal. They fell into a rhythm of it, Matthew riding down from the North Pasture on Saturdays, sometimes on other days as well when there was a specific reason, though the specific reasons had a way of presenting themselves with convenient regularity. He fixed a section of her barn roof one afternoon because he had noticed from a distance that it was compromised, and he came to ask if she wanted it done, and she said yes, and they spent a full day on it together with Hank, the three of them working in a companionable near silence broken by the occasional practical exchange. She rode up to his property once, because Hank mentioned that the water diversion they had agreed upon would need adjustment at the source, and she came up to find the North Pasture was a wide, open stretch of land with good grass, and a view of the mountains that made her stop and simply look for a full minute. The camp he had made up there was spare but not rough, a solid wall tent, a proper camp stove, a folding table and 2 chairs, and a row of books along one side that surprised her deeply. "You read," she said. He was standing beside her looking faintly amused. "You sound surprised." "I am not surprised," she said, though she was at least somewhat surprised. "What do you read?" He showed her history mostly, a worn copy of something by Thoreau, a few novels she recognized and some she did not. She picked up a volume of poetry and raised an eyebrow at him, and he actually looked mildly embarrassed for the first and only time she had ever seen him look that way. "Clara liked poetry," he said. "Do you?" He considered this. "I have come to, maybe," he said carefully. "More than I expected to." She set the book down with care. They adjusted the water diversion together, and then she rode home, and she thought about a man alone on a high pasture with his books and his dog and the mountains, and she thought about what it meant that he had started coming down. November arrived with the first genuine cold, the kind that turned your breath to frost and made the horses blow steam in the mornings. The creek along the property line began to ice over at the edges. Augusta spent her days in the practical, physical labor that a ranch demanded in the approach of winter, putting up feed, checking structures, ensuring the cattle were in good condition, and the hands prepared. Matthew came down on a Saturday in early November and stayed later than he usually did, because a storm front came in off the mountains in the mid-afternoon, and the sky went gray-green in a way that meant business. By the time they recognized what was coming, riding out was not a sensible option. "You should stay," Augusta said, and the words were matter-of-fact even though they were not quite. He looked at the sky, he looked at her. "I can sleep in the barn," he said. "Hank and the hands are in the bunkhouse. You can have Eli's room." She met his gaze evenly. "It's practical, don't make it complicated." "I'm not making it complicated," he said, and he almost smiled. The storm came in hard that evening, wind driving sleet against the windows, and they sat by the fire in the small parlor, a room Augusta rarely used because it had been her parents' room, and it still held the particular quality of their absence more than any other space in the house. But the kitchen stove did not throw heat as well, and tonight the parlor fire was genuinely necessary. She had lamps on and she was mending a piece of harness, a task that required just enough attention to keep her hands occupied, and Matthew had asked if she minded him reading, and she had said she did not, and so they sat in the firelight with the storm roaring outside and a companionable quiet between them that felt, and she registered this with the part of herself that was always being careful like the most natural thing in the world. After a while he closed his book. "Augusta," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with that direct, unguarded gaze, and there was something in it now that had not been visible before. Or perhaps it had been visible and she had been choosing not to see it. "I need to say something," he said. "All right. I have not been certain how to say it or whether it was the right time to say it or whether it was too soon." He paused and she could see the effort of assembling words for something he had not had to put into words before. "I am not a man who says things easily." "I had noticed," she said gently. He looked at her. "I think about you," he said plainly. "Most of the time now. When I'm working or when I'm not working, and when I'm up on the North Pasture, and when I'm writing down here and when I'm writing back. I think about what you said last Saturday and what you'll say next Saturday." He stopped. "I wanted you to know that. I thought you should know it." Augusta set down the harness piece slowly. She had been waiting, she realized, for him to say something like this. She had been waiting and also hoping he would not, because once it was said it became real, and once it was real there was something to lose, and loss was something she had recent and very thorough experience of. "Matthew," she said. "You don't have to say anything back," he said quickly. I needed to say it. I've been saying things inside my head for a long time and not saying them out loud, and I decided tonight that I was going to say it out loud." She looked at him across the firelit room and thought about Clara, whom she had never known, and about her parents, whom she had loved and lost, and about the particular courage it took to say the thing out loud when you had learned that things could be taken from you. "I think about you too," she said. "Considerably." He was very still for a moment. "Considerably," he repeated, with the dry precision that she had come to understand meant he found something genuinely funny. "Quite a lot," she said, and she was smiling now and could not seem to stop. He stood up from his chair and crossed the small parlor to where she sat, and he went down on one knee next to her chair so that he was at her eye level, and he looked at her with an expression that was so open and so careful at once that something inside her came loose. "May I?" he said, and he held out his hand. She put her hand in his. His hand was rough from work and warm from the fire, and he held hers with a gentleness that seemed to require considerable effort, as though his hands were accustomed to strength and had to remember how to be careful. "I have been alone a long time," he said quietly. "I don't know if I have forgotten things about being with someone. I don't want to do this badly." "I have also been alone a long time," Augusta said. "We will work it out." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, and it was such a formal, old-fashioned gesture that it made her chest ache with the sweetness of it. Outside, the storm tore and roared. Inside, the fire burned. They talked until past midnight, sitting close together now, her hand still in his, and it was the most she had ever talked in a single evening, and the most comfortable she had ever felt saying things she had not said before. He slept in Eli's room. She slept in her own room and stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the storm and felt, underneath all the sensible caution she was trying to maintain, an emotion so large she could not find its edges. Morning came bright and white and cold. The storm's aftermath spread across the land in a glittering silence. Matthew helped Hank clear the yard and check on the cattle, and Augusta made breakfast, and they ate together with Hank, who looked between them with the composed satisfaction of a man who had correctly predicted something. When Matthew saddled to ride home, she walked him to the horse. He turned before mounting and looked at her in the pale winter light. "Next Saturday," he said. "And Tuesday," she said, because the water agreement genuinely did need one more adjustment, and she was not above using practical necessity as occasion. He smiled then, a full, real smile, and it broke over his face like something that had been held back a long time and finally came through, and it was such a startling and beautiful thing that she could not immediately speak. He rode north. She watched him go and felt the winter cold sharp on her cheeks, and underneath it, something warm. November deepened. Matthew came down Tuesday and Saturday both, with occasional other days inserted when the reasons were thin enough to be nearly transparent, which both of them had begun to acknowledge with a shared private humor that required no words. A look, a slightly raised brow, a not-quite smile, and the fiction of the practical reason was acknowledged and set aside. He was present at the ranch the morning Pete, one of the seasonal hands, came to tell Augusta that a section of her north boundary fence had come down in the storm aftereffects, and a portion of her cattle had drifted. The three of them, Augusta, Matthew, and Pete, spent the whole day rounding up the drifted animals, riding through the cold with the thin winter sun at their backs, and it was hard physical work, and Augusta did it without complaint, and noticed that Matthew noticed she did it without complaint. And there was something in the way he looked at her at the end of the day, wind-burned and tired and satisfied, that made her feel seen in a way she could not remember feeling in a long time. At the end of that day, he had pressed his cold, roughened fingers briefly against her cheek before he mounted, a touch so fleeting it was barely there, and she had stood entirely still until he rode away. December arrived, and with it the full weight of Colorado winter. The North Pasture was no longer a sensible place to be keeping a camp, and Matthew moved back into his house, which was a proper ranch house 2 miles north of the property line, a place Augusta had never visited. He invited her to come see it, which she did on a Sunday afternoon in early December, riding up with Hank as company because she was being careful, she was being sensible. The Garrison house was larger than she expected, a solid frame structure with a proper parlor and a kitchen, and a study lined with bookshelves that made her feel warmly disposed toward the whole property. It wanted a woman's management in visible ways that she took note of, and then firmly told herself not to take note of. Matthew showed her through with a self-consciousness that was touching. He kept apologizing for the state of things, for the absence of curtains, for the general spareness of a house that had been maintained for function and not comfort. "It is a good house," she told him, and she meant it. "It was better before," he said quietly, and she understood he meant before Clara, and she simply nodded and did not try to offer comfort for something that did not need verbal comforting. They had dinner at the Garrison house that afternoon, a meal Matthew had prepared himself that was better than she expected, and which she said so, and he gave her the look that meant he found her funny, and Hank ate it stolidly and mentioned twice that the beef was well seasoned, which constituted a rave review coming from Hank. The 4 miles round trip between the properties became familiar ground that both of them traversed regularly through December and into the turn of the year. 1884 arrived on a night of bitter cold and brilliant stars, and Augusta stood outside on her porch at midnight and breathed the freezing air, and thought that the year turning felt different this time. Less like a door closing behind her, more like one opening up ahead. On the first Saturday of January, Matthew arrived later than usual, and he was carrying something. When he dismounted, she could see it was a parcel wrapped in burlap, and he handed it to her with the studied casualness that meant he was slightly anxious. She unwrapped it at the kitchen table. It was a book, a proper bound volume, not worn, newer than anything on his shelves, a collection of poetry. She opened the cover, and there was an inscription in a handwriting she recognized as his, steady and careful, because he did everything steadily and carefully. It read, "For Augusta, who made me say things out loud. M.G." She looked up at him, and he was watching her with that contained, careful attention. "Matthew," she said. "It is not extravagant," he said quickly. "I know that, but I wanted to." "It is perfect," she said. He looked at her. "You haven't read it yet." "The inscription," she said. "That is perfect." He was quiet for a moment. She stood up from her chair and crossed to where he was standing by the kitchen door, still in his coat, and she put her hand against his jaw, the jaw that was properly shaved now on Saturdays, she had noticed, and she reached up and kissed him. He went very still for a half-second, and then his hands came up and he held her with a gentleness that had that same quality as when he had held her hand, the quality of great strength being carefully restrained, and he kissed her back with the focused, deliberate attention he brought to everything. When they separated, she kept her hand against his jaw and looked up at him, and his expression was something she had no adequate word for, something that was very full and very quiet at once. "I have wanted to do that since October," she said. "October," he said. "I have wanted to do that since the morning I rode up and found you mending fence with wire cutters in your hand, looking like you would personally correct the behavior of anyone or anything that displeased you." She laughed. She could not help it. "That is the least romantic description I have ever heard." "I meant it as a compliment," he said, and now he was smiling fully, and she thought she would never get tired of seeing him smile. "It is not a competition," she said, "but I am fairly certain I said a more romantic thing." "You said October," he said. "That is not particularly romantic. Everything else I said was." "That is fair," he allowed. Winter moved through January into February, and the cold was profound and real, the kind that required constant vigilance on a working ranch, checking water sources and keeping the cattle fed and ensuring nothing froze that needed to remain functional. Augusta and Matthew navigated the season together in an increasingly organic way, her ranch and his connected by the easy passage between properties, the shared labor of adjacent land in a hard season. Hank watched all of this with the calm satisfaction of a man who had known Augusta since she was small enough to be carried, and who approved of what he was seeing. He said nothing about it directly, but he had begun occasionally having things to attend to at the far end of the property when Matthew arrived, which was not subtle, and Augusta had stopped pretending not to notice. The two hands, Pete and Cord, were less discreet. Cord in particular made a comment one afternoon that caused Pete to elbow him hard in the ribs, and when Augusta fixed them both with a look that could have cut glass, they occupied themselves with immediate and urgent fence-related business. Matthew heard about this and found it quietly amusing in a way he wisely chose not to express too openly. In February, something happened that changed the texture of things. A man came to the Garrison property. Augusta heard about it from Hank, who heard about it from Pete, who had been fixing a water trough near the north property line and observed the encounter from a distance. The man's name was Briggs, and he was a land agent from a company out of Denver that had been acquiring grazing land throughout the region. He had come to make Matthew an offer for the Garrison property. Matthew sent him away. He told Augusta about it himself the following Saturday, without her having to indicate she had already heard a version of it. He offered a fair price, Matthew said. He was looking out the kitchen window at the frozen yard. Maybe better than fair. Augusta sat with her coffee and kept her voice neutral. "What did you say?" "I said no." He turned from the window. "I built that house. My wife died in that house. My cattle have been on that land for 6 years. He paused. "I also said no because of other reasons." She met his eyes. "Other reasons," she said. "You are south of me," he said simply. "I am not leaving." Something in her chest did the warm, tight thing that it did in his presence, more frequently and with less warning than it had in October. "That is a good reason," she said. "It is not a complete reason," he said, and now he crossed the kitchen to where she was sitting and stood beside her and put his hand on her shoulder, the warm weight of it steady and certain. "Augusta," she looked up at him. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with whatever your definition of properly is. I am aware that you are a woman of independent means who manages her own affairs, and I am not interested in changing that. I am interested in being part of what you are managing." He paused. "I am saying this badly." "You are saying it quite well," she said. "I would like to marry you," he said, "eventually, when we are both ready and when you want that. I am not making demands. I am telling you the direction I am heading." Augusta looked at the man standing in her kitchen, the man who had come down off his hill after 3 seasons because her cattle dispute had required it, and who had sat at her kitchen table and drunk her coffee and talked to her and fixed her fence and held her hand in the firelight, who had carried a poem book 2 miles through January cold, who had turned down a land offer because she was south of him. She looked at him with his careful, honest, slightly anxious eyes and his steady hands and the particular quality of attention he brought to everything, including her. "Matthew," she said. "Yes. I would like that too," she said. "The eventually, and the direction." He exhaled, and she could see that he had been holding something very carefully for some time, and now he set it down. He sat beside her and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and outside the February wind moved across the frozen Colorado plain, and inside the kitchen was warm. Spring came slowly, the way it did in that part of Colorado, reluctantly and then all at once. The snow began to pull back from the hillsides in March, and the creek along the property line ran full and cold with snowmelt, and the cattle that had been wintered on hay began to move to fresh grass with the blissed-out focus of animals who had been patient for a long time. Matthew began spending more time at the Abbott Ranch, not just Saturdays and invented weekday reasons, but regularly and openly, helping with spring work, riding out with Hank and the hands to assess what the winter had done to the land. His own property was managed with admirable self-sufficiency. He had a man named Owen who had worked for him 4 years, a solid and reliable hand who could be trusted with the day-to-day when Matthew was elsewhere. It was Owen who let slip, in the uncautious way that men let things slip when they are talking to other men, and not considering who might be listening, that Matthew had been up to the North Pasture one more time in early March. Augusta found out because Hank told her with that composed expression he used when he was delivering information he considered significant. "He went back up," she said. "Couple days," Hank said. "Owen says he went up, stayed 2 nights, came back down." Augusta thought about this. She thought about what the North Pasture had been, a retreat, a grief cave, the place he had gone when he did not know what to do with himself. And she thought about the fact that he had come back down again in a couple of days this time, rather than 3 seasons. She rode up to the Garrison house that afternoon and found him in the barn. He looked at her and knew immediately, she could see it in the slight set of his shoulders, that she knew something. "You went up," she said. 2 days, he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, running a currying brush along the dark horse's flank in long, steady strokes. "I needed to say goodbye," he said at last. "To that version of things, to the way I had been living." He paused. "I wanted to go up there and look at it clearly and then come back down of my own choosing." Augusta stood in the barn doorway and looked at him, this man who was so deliberate about everything, who said things plainly when he chose to say them, who had understood something that she understood too, that grief could not be left behind without being properly acknowledged. "Did it work?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. She crossed the barn and put her hand on his arm, and he turned and looked at her, and his expression was clear and quiet in a way it had not always been. "Good," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she stood beside him while the horse stood patiently under the brush, and outside the spring light was pale gold through the barn door. Caldwell in the springtime was a more animated place than in winter, the main street livelier, the supply wagons more frequent, the conversation at the general store ranging across the whole spectrum of frontier concerns. Augusta had always navigated town on her own, managing the ranch's commercial business with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Now she navigated it with Matthew occasionally accompanying her, and this, she quickly discovered, changed the social texture of the experience considerably. People noticed. Caldwell was not a large town, and both the Abbott and Garrison ranches were well known in the county, and the sight of Augusta Abbott and Matthew Garrison coming into the general store together, standing close enough at the counter to suggest familiarity, was exactly the kind of information a small community absorbed and processed with great enthusiasm. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, who ran the dress and goods shop next to the hardware, stopped Augusta on the street with barely contained excitement and asked if there was anything she should know. And Augusta told her pleasantly that the spring had been mild so far and the cattle were looking well, and moved on before Mrs. Whitmore could recover from this disappointment. The land agent, Briggs, came back in April. This time he came to the Abbott Ranch, which surprised Augusta considerably. He was a well-dressed man from Denver with an easy manner that she did not trust, and he sat at her kitchen table, where she and Matthew had sat on so many mornings. And he explained that the company he represented was interested in consolidating several parcels of land in the county for a large-scale grazing operation, and that the Abbott property was quite attractively situated. "It is attractively situated because of the creek and the south pasture," he said, which confirmed that he understood land even if she disliked his interest in hers. "I am not selling," Augusta said. "I haven't named a price yet," Briggs said. "You could name any price," Augusta said. "I am not selling." He tried several approaches, the way a good salesman does, cycling through different angles of appeal. The difficulty of running a property alone, the market conditions, the opportunity to start fresh elsewhere. Augusta listened to all of them with the composure of a woman who had heard variations of this her entire life and had made her peace with it. "This land is my family's land," she said at last. "My parents are buried at the east corner. The answer is no, Mr. Briggs, and it will not become yes with additional conversation." He left. He went, she later found out, directly from her property to the Garrison property, where he once again made his offer to Matthew, who turned him down once again. Then Briggs went to 2 other properties in the county, both of which accepted, and then he left Caldwell and did not return, and the matter was resolved. But the visit shook something loose in Augusta that surprised her. She had been so certain, so immediately and totally certain, that she was not selling. Not because she had not been offered enough, not because the economics could not be made to work, but because the land was hers, and her parents were in the ground at the east corner, and she had not gone through 2 years of hard solitary work to hand it to a Denver company. The certainty had been so complete that it frightened her slightly, the way very complete certainties sometimes do when you catch yourself feeling them. She told Matthew about it that evening. He listened, and when she was done he looked at her with that steady gold-brown gaze. "It frightens you," he said, "feeling that certain." "I have lost things I was certain about," she said. "You haven't lost the land." "Not yet, Augusta." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You are one of the most capable people I have ever known. The land is yours. It is going to stay yours." She turned her hand under his and gripped it. "Capable," she said. "You might work on your romantic compliments," he smiled. "I meant it as a compliment." "I know you did," she said. "That's actually why I like you." May came in gold and green, the land coming into full bloom after the long winter, and Augusta Abbott stood on her south pasture one morning in the early light and watched her cattle move through good grass and felt something she had been a long time without feeling, the uncomplicated sense that things were right. Not perfect. The creek still needed attention on the north section, and the barn roof was developing a new soft spot, and Cord had given notice that he was riding to Texas for reasons he was vague about, which meant she needed a new hand. Things were never without complication, but underneath the complication there was a rightness. She had been thinking about what Matthew had said in January, the eventually, the direction. She was ready. She told him on a Saturday morning in late May, sitting at her kitchen table in the early light with biscuits on the board and the warm smell of coffee in the air. "I want the eventually," she said. "I'm not saying next week. I'm saying I'm ready to move toward it." He put down his cup and looked at her with complete attention. "Are you asking me or telling me?" He said, and there was the quiet humor in it. "I am informing you of my position," she said, "and inviting you to respond." He reached into his coat pocket. She looked at what he put on the table. It was a ring, a simple, narrow gold band with a small dark stone that caught the light. "Clara's ring was different," he said. "I found this at the jeweler's in Pueblo when I went for supplies last month. I have been carrying it since then." He looked at her steadily, waiting for the eventually. Augusta looked at the ring on the table and then at the man across from her. Outside, the May morning was doing its best work, all light and warmth and possibility. Inside, the kitchen held the warmth of the stove and the coffee and the history of all the mornings they had sat in this room and talked themselves to the place they were now. "Matthew Garrison," she said. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he said. "If you will." "I will," she said. He picked up the ring and reached across the table and took her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger with the careful precision he brought to everything. The stone was a dark garnet, and it caught the morning light and held it. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Good," she said, and she was crying a little, which she had not expected, and she was not a woman who cried easily, which made it more and not less. He came around the table and she stood up, and he held her the way he had held her before, with the strength carefully reined in, with the gentleness that was not absence of strength but its deliberate use, and she put her face against his shoulder and breathed. "I'm not going to be easy to be married to," she said into his coat. "I know it," he said, and she could hear the warmth in his voice. "I'm not particularly easy either." "We will work it out," she said. "We will work it out," he agreed. The wedding was in July, which in Colorado meant clear blue skies and heat that was dry and clean and bearable if you were not standing in the sun for too long. Hank Dooley stood up with Matthew because he had known both of them the longest of anyone, and Augusta's brother Eli came out from St. Louis where his law studies were going apparently well, and he was delighted, and said so in the voluble way he had always had, which was the opposite of Augusta in almost every particular. Matthew liked Eli immediately, which was not something Augusta had entirely predicted, and which warmed her to observe. The ceremony was at the Caldwell Church, performed by Reverend Marsh, and it was brief and plain in the way that both Augusta and Matthew preferred: no excessive performance, no elaboration beyond what the moment required. The words they said to each other they meant, and that was the whole of it. Mrs. Whitmore from the dress shop cried loudly enough to be heard in the back row, which Augusta would have found irritating under other circumstances, but which struck her on this particular day as merely part of the whole large, complicated, beautiful fabric of the thing. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Abbott Ranch, which had by general consensus been determined to be where the household would be established, both because of its size and because the Garrison property would be managed by Owen during the transition period while they worked out the long-term arrangement. Matthew had no difficulty with this. He had said he was not leaving because she was south of him, and south of him he was, now more literally than before. The evening of the wedding, after the guests had gone and Eli was asleep in his old room and Hank had gone to the bunkhouse with the equanimity of a man who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing, Augusta and Matthew stood in the kitchen together in the lamplight. "Hello, Mrs. Garrison," Matthew said quietly. She considered. "I think I will remain Miss Abbott professionally," she said, "for the ranch's business purposes." "That is entirely reasonable," he said. "But not to you," she said. "No," he said, "not to me." She took his hand. The summer was the most beautiful she could remember. The work of the ranch continued as it always did, because the land did not stop requiring attention for personal reasons, and if anything the addition of Matthew's full and constant presence made the work lighter, not because he did more, though he did work hard, but because the quality of two people doing a thing together had a momentum that alone work did not carry. Owen managed the Garrison property through the summer with admirable competence, and Matthew rode up regularly to oversee and make decisions, and by September they had worked out an arrangement by which the two properties operated under shared management, the cattle from both herds rotating between pastures with an efficiency that Hank approved of, which was the highest standard available. Matthew moved his books into the Garrison house's study, their study now, though the adjustment of possessives was still sometimes strange, and augmented them with Augusta's collection, which was smaller but contained several volumes he had not read and which he worked through in the evenings with the focused pleasure of a man who had been a reader his whole life. She found him one evening with the poetry book, the one he had given her in January, and she raised an eyebrow. "Revisiting," he said. "Reading me my own book." "Reminding myself," he said, and she thought of the way he had said that word in her kitchen on the morning they drank coffee together for the first time, when she had asked if keeping her mother's habits helped. Does it help? Sometimes, she had said. Sometimes it just reminds you. Yes, he had said. That. She sat down next to him, and he read her a poem, quietly, in the evening light, and she sat with her shoulder against his, and thought that this was what she had not known she was waiting for, not the absence of hard work or difficulty or loss, but the presence of someone to sit beside in the evening. October came around again, a full year from that morning on the fence line, and Augusta stood in the yard one bright October morning watching the cattle move through the south pasture, and thought of the circuit of it, the letter from the land office, the formal complaint, the sound of hoofbeats from the north, a man on a dark horse coming down from his hill after 3 seasons because she had filed a dispute, and apparently her name on a county document had done what nothing else had managed. Matthew came up behind her and stood looking at the same pasture. Thinking, he said. A year ago, she said, he was quiet for a moment. She could feel the warmth of him beside her in the cool October air. I have been thinking about something, he said. Tell me. The north pasture, he said. I want to build up there, properly. A real structure, not just a camp. The grass is good and the view is worth the elevation, and if we winter a portion of the herd in the lower pastures, we can run them up in summer and it extends the range. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the south pasture, his expression thoughtful and animated in the way it got when he was working through something practical. That makes good sense, she said. I thought you'd say that. He looked at her then, and there was the warmth in his eyes that had been there since January, since the biscuits and the poetry book, since the firelight and the storm. I also want to build a proper lookout point up there, because the view of the mountains is genuinely something. You want to build a viewing platform, she said, on a cattle pasture. It can be both things, he said with dignity. She smiled. Yes, she said, it can. The winter of 1884 was gentler than the previous one, or perhaps it only seemed so. Augusta was pregnant by December, a fact she confirmed with the measured calm she brought to most things, and told Matthew on a cold evening by the parlor fire. He went very still and she watched him absorb it. Are you well? He said first, which was exactly what she had hoped he would say. I am very well, she said. Healthy, everything appears as it should. He let out a long breath. He took her hands. He looked at her with an expression that was several things at once, joy and something fragile underneath it, and she understood the fragile thing without having to say anything about it, because Clara had died in this house, and he was a man who knew that things could be taken. Matthew, she said quietly, I am going to be fine. You don't know that, he said very quietly. No, she admitted, but I intend to be. And I am strong and healthy, and the nearest doctor is in Caldwell, and Hank's wife helped deliver half the babies in this county before she passed. She squeezed his hands. We will be careful and we will be prepared, and we will be fine. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him choosing to believe her, choosing to let the joy be larger than the fear. We, he said. We, she confirmed. He pulled her carefully toward him and held her, and she felt his careful, restrained strength, and she put her face against his shoulder and felt the warmth of the parlor fire at her back. Hank, when informed, simply nodded and went back to work. Eli wrote an enormously enthusiastic letter from St. Louis, Owen, up at the Garrison property, expressed his congratulations with the reserved sincerity of a man of few words who meant the ones he used. The winter passed gently. Augusta moved through her days with the ranch demanding as much as it ever did, because cows did not know about pregnancies and fences required attention regardless. Matthew was watchful without being smothering, which was a balance she appreciated, because she had seen how smothering tended to go when well-intentioned men decided a woman needed protecting from her own competence. He was not like that. He adapted to her needs without making a performance of it. If she was tired in the evening, supper appeared without comment. If she needed to ride out, he rode with her without suggesting she stay behind. He simply paid attention and responded to what was actually needed, which was, she thought, the fullest expression of the kind of man he was. She told him so one evening in February, when the winter was beginning to loosen its grip and the first hints of spring were appearing at the south edge of the property. He looked mildly embarrassed, which was the response he had to direct appreciation, the same look he had given her when she had seen the poetry on his shelf. "I just try to see what's actually there," he said. "Most people don't," she said. "Most people see what they expect," he agreed. "It's easier." She leaned against his shoulder. The lamp burned, the house was quiet. "Matthew," she said, "I'm glad I filed the dispute." He made a sound that was very close to a laugh. "I am glad you filed the dispute. Hank thought I might not. He thought I'd let it go." "Why?" "He said I was always careful about not causing trouble with the neighbors." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "The trouble," he said at last, "turned out reasonably well." "Considerably," she agreed. "There's that word again," he said, and she could hear the warmth in it. Their son was born in early April of 1885, on a morning when the spring was coming through the windows in long light bars, and the creek was running full with snowmelt, and the world outside was the pale, insistent green of things returning. He was a healthy boy, strong and loud about the indignity of his arrival, and Augusta held him in the morning light with Matthew sitting on the edge of the bed beside her, and the doctor from Caldwell was packing his bag at the other side of the room, and Hank was outside the door pretending not to pace. "He looks like you," Matthew said. Augusta looked at the baby, who at 1 hour old mostly looked like a very emphatic, red-faced small person. "He does not look like anyone yet," she said. "He has your expression," Matthew said. "He has been alive for an hour." "The look," Matthew said. "The one that means he is about to do exactly what he intends, and anyone in the way should reconsider their position." Augusta looked at her son and then at her husband and felt the full weight of the moment, the alive and complicated and enormous fact of it. "His name," Matthew said softly. They had discussed names. They had discussed several and circled back to two that kept presenting themselves. "James," she said. "James Daniel Garrison, James for her father, Daniel for his." Matthew looked at the baby, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, stripped of all its usual careful management, simply and completely present to what was in front of him. "James Daniel," he said quietly. Hank was allowed in to see the baby and sat with him for 3 minutes in a silence of complete sufficiency, then went back to work. James Daniel Garrison grew with the confident application that characterized his parents. He was a serious baby who became an observant toddler who appeared to have inherited his mother's capacity for assessment and his father's capacity for silence, which combined in a small child to a somewhat unnerving self-possession that caused both of them to occasionally look at him with private amusement. The spring of 1885 brought other changes. Matthew finished the structure he had been planning for the North Pasture. Not just a building, but a proper small homestead that could be used during summer grazing season. And on its highest point, he had built what could only be described as a viewing platform, a simple wooden deck with a railing, oriented perfectly toward the mountain view. He brought Augusta up on a May morning to see it, the two of them riding up from the south with James in a carrier rig that Matthew had devised with characteristic practical ingenuity. And when they reached the platform and Augusta stood at the railing with the mountain spread before her in the clear morning light and the vast plain of the land below, she understood why he had stayed up here so long. "It's something," she said. "Yes," he said. James from the carrier made a sound of interest and reached toward the mountains as though he might collect them. "He likes it," Matthew said. "He will probably want to build a fence around it," Augusta said. Matthew put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood at the railing and looked at the mountains, and the spring wind came up across the plateau and moved through the grass. And below them on the south property, the Abbott ranch lay in the morning sun. And below that to the north, the Garrison house with the new bookshelves and the curtains that Augusta had finally gotten around to. And the whole of it was theirs in the particular way that things become yours when you have worked for them and loved them and chosen to stay. Eli came to visit in June with news. He had passed his exams and would be remaining in St. Louis to take a position with a firm, but he intended to come west every year, and he spent 2 weeks at the ranch that summer being comprehensively charmed by James, who regarded his uncle with the wary interest of a person calibrating a new element. By the end of the visit, Eli had decided James was the finest child he had ever encountered, which James accepted with equanimity. The summer of 1885 was golden in the way that some summers are, productive and warm and unhurried in its essential texture, the work of the ranch moving forward with the accumulated efficiency of 2 years of shared management, the cattle in good condition, the pastures recovered from the lean winter of 2 years past. Augusta and Matthew had settled into the particular intimacy of two people who have learned each other's rhythms, who know which silences are companionable and which need addressing, who have navigated difficulty together and come through it. They still disagreed, and sometimes with some heat, because they were both people of strong opinion and neither was inclined to yield position simply for the sake of peace. But the disagreements resolved, because they had both learned the other's honesty was consistent and could be trusted. He still read in the evenings. She still mended things with the focused attention of someone who found the task meditative. Sometimes one of them would read aloud and the other would listen. Sometimes they simply occupied the same quiet together, which was, Augusta had come to understand, its own form of closeness. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been 2 years ago, standing at the kitchen window with a letter in her hand and a cold cup of coffee, bone-tired and alone in the beautiful, difficult weight of her inheritance. She did not miss that solitude exactly, but she understood it now with more tenderness than she had from within it. It had been necessary, that time of being solely herself, learning the full shape of her own capacity. And then a man had come down off a hill because she had filed a dispute, and had drunk her coffee and held her hand in the firelight and brought her a book of poetry in January cold, and had said the direction I am heading, and had meant it. She found him one morning in the fall of 1885 standing at the south fence line, the fence he had repaired 2 years ago, looking south across her pasture. She rode up and stopped beside him and followed his gaze. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "The same thing I was looking at when I rode down the first time," he said. "You." She turned to find him looking at her, not at the pasture. "I was at the fence," she said. "You were at the fence," he said. "With wire cutters in your hand and an expression that would have stopped a lesser man." "But not you," she said. "I considered stopping," he said honestly. "Then I thought she needs to know about the fence." "I knew about the fence." "I know you knew, but I needed an approach." She stared at him. "Matthew Garrison, are you telling me that the fence was an approach?" "The fence was a legitimate concern," he said with great dignity. "The approach was incidental." She laughed. She laughed and she could not stop, and he watched her laugh with the expression she loved best on him, the one that was private and warm and entirely for her. "An approach," she said. 2 years of Saturdays and you led with a fence." "It was a good fence," he said. She rode up beside him and leaned sideways in the saddle and kissed him, which required considerable equestrian balance, and he steadied her with a hand that knew exactly how much steadying she required and provided exactly that. The fall turned, the land going gold and red as the aspens on the western slopes caught the cold, and James, who was 7 months old now and doing the preliminary work of locomotion with great seriousness, pulled himself upright on the kitchen table leg and regarded the room from his new altitude with the expression of someone who had solved an important problem. Matthew, watching from the doorway, said, "There it is." "There what is?" Augusta asked from the stove. "The expression," he said. "He was doing exactly what he intends." Augusta turned to look at her son, who was holding himself vertical with the complete focused conviction of a person who has decided to stand and will not be revised on the matter, and she felt the large, clean, whole-body joy of the thing. "James Daniel," she said. He looked at her. "Well done," she said. He considered this acknowledgment, deemed it satisfactory, and immediately sat down, because he had accomplished what he set out to, and additional standing was optional. Matthew came into the kitchen and stood behind her and wrapped his arms around her, and she leaned back against him. And they watched their son on the kitchen floor work through his calculations about the mechanics of movement. And the stove was warm, and the autumn light was gold through the window, and outside the land was theirs. The Abbott land and the Garrison land and the creek between them and the north pasture with its mountains, and its viewing platform, and the south fence line where a man had come down off his hill, because a woman had filed a dispute and forgotten to be anything other than exactly herself. By the following spring there was another baby coming, and Augusta told Matthew about it in the kitchen on a Saturday morning with the biscuits warm on the board, and he looked at her across the table with the same expression he had worn the first time, the joy and the fragile thing underneath it, and she reached across and put her hand over his. "Still going to be fine," she said. "You cannot promise that," he said. "No," she said, "but I have every intention. And I am asking you to be with me in the intention." He turned his hand over and held hers. "I am with you," he said. The baby came in October, a girl this time, and they named her Clara for his, Anne for her mother, and James, who was now 18 months old and of settled opinion on most things, regarded his sister with the wary professional assessment of someone evaluating an uncertain variable. Within a week he had decided she was acceptable. His regard for her, once bestowed, was total. Augusta stood at the kitchen window one morning in the early winter of 1886, holding Clara while James investigated something of apparent importance in the yard outside, and Matthew came up beside her and looked out. "He found a rock," Matthew said. "He finds a new rock every morning," Augusta said. "He is studying rocks. He is thorough. He is your son." Matthew looked at her with the quiet amusement she would never tire of seeing. He took the baby carefully. He had become, to her ongoing delight, a man of considerable competence with small children, applying the same focused attention to the management of an infant that he brought to the management of cattle, which worked better than she might have predicted, and held Clara against his shoulder. And Clara regarded the middle distance with the ancient gravity of very small babies. "Augusta," he said, "I want to say something." She turned from the window to look at him. "I spent 3 seasons on a hill," he said, "because I did not know what else to do, and I came down because you sent a piece of paper to the county office with your name on it, and I was not going to let a piece of paper represent my last interaction with the world." He paused. "And I want to say that I know I would not be here in this kitchen with you and these children and this life if not for that." He looked at her steadily. "I want to say that to you, that I know it." Augusta looked at her husband, the man who had come down from his hill, who had drunk coffee at her table and fixed her fence and carried books through January cold and said things out loud when he had decided to say them, who held her daughter against his shoulder with one large careful hand and looked at her with eyes that saw what was actually there. "I would have filed that dispute either way," she said. "The cattle were on my pasture." "I know," he said, smiling. "But I am glad," she said, "that you rode down to settle it." "And forgot the dispute entirely," he added, because he had been thinking this too, both of them, on that first morning over coffee. The cattle and the fence and the formal complaint had dissolved like morning frost somewhere between the first cup and the second, and what had remained was 2 people at a table talking. "You fixed the fence," she pointed out. "Eventually," he said, "and the dispute was settled." "Eventually," he said again. "Everything eventually," she said. He crossed to her, baby against his shoulder, and she put her hand against his jaw the way she had on that January morning, and he turned his face slightly into it. And outside the winter morning was bright and cold, and James was deeply absorbed in his rock, and Clara was regarding the universe with the settled authority of a person who has recently arrived and intends to stay. This was not the end of anything. This was the ongoing, live, breathing middle of everything. The cattle that needed moving, and the fences that needed mending, and the creek that needed watching, and the children who needed tending, and the books that needed reading, and the biscuits on Saturday mornings that were her mother's habit and now were hers and would become, perhaps, someone else's habit in time. And through all of it, the man who had come down from his hill, who had said, "I am not leaving," who held her hand and read her poetry and fixed what was broken and said things out loud and meant them, who stood beside her at the railing and looked at the mountains, who sat across the kitchen table in the morning light and looked at her the way he always looked at her, completely, without reservation, without looking away. Augusta Abbott had filed a grazing dispute. She had not expected it to settle everything. She had not expected to forget the dispute entirely. She was very glad she had. The ranch ran on through the years that followed, as ranches do, with the rhythm of seasons and work and animals and growing things, and James grew into a boy of serious purpose, who did indeed inherit his father's capacity for quiet observation and his mother's capacity for direct action. And Clara grew into a girl of fierce opinion, who appeared to have distilled the most concentrated qualities of both of them, which kept everyone on their toes. Hank duly worked the Abbott land until he was 70, at which point Augusta and Matthew pensioned him with a genuine and emphatic generosity that made the old man uncomfortable and grateful in equal measure, and he lived out his days in a house in Caldwell that they helped him obtain, and Augusta rode to see him every third Sunday until he passed in the winter of 1892 as a man of great age and uncomplaining satisfaction. Eli visited every summer, as promised, and eventually brought a wife from St. Louis, a woman named Margaret who was brisk and intelligent, and won James's respect on her third day by correctly identifying the geological composition of his current rock collection, and who won Augusta's regard entirely by looking at the ranch with the appreciation of someone who understood what she was seeing. Owen managed the Garrison property until Matthew folded the two operations formally under one management structure in 1887, a practical step they had been edging toward for 2 years, which simplified the paperwork considerably and allowed them to run the combined herd with the efficiency of a single operation across 400 acres that had once been 2 properties and was now simply theirs. The North Pasture with its viewing platform became a place the children went with their father in the summer, riding up in the early morning to check the cattle and stand at the railing and look at the mountains, which did not change and did not require anything of you and were, Matthew always said, good for perspective. Augusta went up too, sometimes. Not as often as the children, because her mornings were the biscuit mornings and the kitchen light, but occasionally. And she would stand at the railing beside Matthew and look at the mountains in the early light and think about the years of it, the whole accumulated weight and color and texture of the life they had built in this difficult, beautiful, demanding, generous country, and she would feel underneath all the complexity and the labor and the love and the loss the steady bedrock fact of it. She had sent a letter. He had come down, and they had, both of them, been better at arriving than they had expected to be. The children grew. The mountain stood. The cattle grazed the South Pasture and the North Pasture in the rotation that Hank had approved of, which was the highest standard available, and the creek ran along the boundary line that was no longer quite a boundary, and the kitchen was warm on Saturday mornings, and the biscuits were always ready, and at the table in the morning light, which fell through the window in the same long bars it always had, 2 people sat across from each other and talked and listened and looked and did not look away.